Thank you very much. It's a very nice introduction. I don't know if I don't know if I'm a fox amongst the hens or if I'm a hen amongst the foxes. This is not my usual speaking environment, and really my pleasure to be here with exactly the kind of people that I'd like to be speaking to. I'll say just a few more things about my role and some of my experience, just so everybody understands kind of where I'm coming from. I started my career as an epidemiologist studying infant and child growth, and through that work became quite adept at statistical modeling and developed an interest in that. And one of the things I've learned in health research is if you're the person who says, I like statistics, people find you real fast and will provide plenty of opportunities for you to do the statistics, so to speak, for them. And in that role, I was, a kind of traditional academic leading my own research, kind of doing things the way I thought they should be done, and growing in that way. The big change for me came over 10 years ago when I was able to get the role now that I'm in, and that's with our clinical research facility in Cork. And so most of you, probably all of you, be very aware of the HRB's investments in the clinical research infrastructure through the CRFs, through the networks, through things like the TMRN and lots of other initiatives. And really how my job changed there is I stopped being a scientist who was leading my own research. And then really my goal became to facilitate other people's high quality research, or, research led by others. And I also became very familiarized very quickly with the role of research regulation, which is largely non-existent, to the experience I'd had as an epidemiologist doing life course epidemiology. Now there was a regulator. Now there was there were rules and there were guidelines and there was quality processes. These were things that were completely new to me before I started in this CRF role. And they've really affected how I approach data and analysis and all the rest of it. Just to add a few more things, I've been a member of the National Research Ethics Committee for clinical trials since its inception. And before that, I spent a number of years on the Animal Ethics Research Committee down in Cork. And for people who wouldn't know, the animal ethics requires actually as a legal obligation to have statistical review of all applications before it goes to the regulator. Whereas on the human side, the statistical review is done by the regulator. And so it's a really important distinction there. I also am a trustee or a council member for the Royal Statistical Society, which is not just a professional organization for statisticians and data scientists, but also a charity focused on the appropriate use of data in society for societal good. And then I sit on steering committees for SONRI, which is our National Research Data Stewardship Network, and for a fledgling Irish Research Reproducibility Network, following on the very successful UK model. So this is the point in the talk where I'm going to share, and despite sharing things 4 million times on the rest of it, it's a 50-50 shot whether this ever works. So I will click the buttons, see the talk, hit the share, go to full screen. And can everybody see the first slide?
Yeah, we can see it. Perfect now. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And just to say that the surname is Daly. The H is Norwegian and puzzlingly silent. But I've said everything else you need to know, I think, at this point. So I'll just go ahead and get cracking. So, by the way, feel free if I say something you just misunderstand or whatever, feel free to interrupt. But I'm sure we'll have plenty of discussion at the end if you want to hold kind of more substantive thoughts. For me, the North Star starts with this paper. If I were to pick one thing, this is essentially a 4-paragraph paper. It was published in the BMJ in 1994 by a statistician named Doug Altman, who not too recently passed away. Many of you will probably be familiar with Doug Altman. He's been really instrumental in a lot of reporting guidelines around medical and health research. And what Doug Altman said in this provocatively titled kind of essay, really, with the scandal of poor medical research, Doug Altman pointed out that if we had a surgeon who was using suboptimal methods, right, who was going into surgery and was doing things that people didn't understand or wasn't to the best quality, that would be a complete and utter scandal. But what isn't scandalous and wasn't scandalous when Doug was writing this was the idea that the research that underpins a lot of what informs what we think best practice is, guidelines, and the rest of it, that a lot of that research is performed to a very low standard of quality. And there's a lot of history and a lot of evidence for this to be true. I'll ask you to take my word for it for now. We can discuss it if we need to. And that's what Doug was pointing out. But beyond that, what Doug got right to the heart of, and many people have landed in this exact same place, was really the diagnosis was, why is this the case? And it's because we are incentivized and driven to maximize publication. And when we have, when we're maximizing something in one way, there are always going to be costs. And the cost of that is often going to be the quality of what it is we're producing. And so Doug finishes off with this very memorable and I think provocative, conclusion. We need less research, I think, which is a very strange thing for lots of people to hear. And I have very little doubt if I rocked up into any vice chancellor or vice dean of research in Ireland or anywhere else and explained how we need to be doing a lot less research, they would probably throw me out on my ear. But that is the general perspective I come from. Now, over time, these ideas have kind of taken root in lots of different ways. And one of them is through the research waste kind of framework. And again, I think I'll be preaching to the converted here in a lot of ways, but just to say that, this started with a paper in the Lancet. This wound up then being turned into a special series in the Lancet on research waste. And now we're starting to see these ideas propagate through research guidance. So this comes through NIHR, NHS, and through to the HSC research strategy. And just the basic idea of research waste, again, is a lot of things that this group will be very familiar with. If we want research that's actually going to impact decision-making and policy, we have to start with good question, right? So PPI, priority setting, all of those things that many of you are involved in, of course, has to be the root of anything. We have to start in the right place. Assuming then we've got a good question, we know we have to design the study appropriately. We need to analyze the data appropriately and plan for that in a mistake-free context. And that's, of course, the kind of work that I do as a principal statistician and someone who leads a small team of data managers and methodological experts. So if we have the good question, we have the good methods, we do everything right, we still have to make sure that the stuff we produce gets to decision makers. And of course, this is kind of open access movement and those things, which has been successful and a problem. And we can come back to that maybe. And then more recently, they've added this part about the efficient research regulation and delivery. We know that research is important. It has costs and it has risks. And so there has to be some framework for doing that in an intelligent way, in a safe way. But we also, I'm sure everybody here is very, familiar with the idea that maybe we could be efficient or more efficient in some ways. And these inefficiencies in regulation administration do lead to research waste as well. So that's where we were until the end of last year. And again, lots of evidence to underpin all of those aspects of research waste. But what really stood out was this most recent update to the Declaration of Helsinki. And for the first time, Helsinki avoided the explicit language of avoiding research waste. And for someone like myself, who's been talking about research waste and ideas about how to prevent it and the rest of it, seeing this, put into the Declaration of Helsinki was to me somewhat of a watermark moment or watershed moment. It's really important that this language is there. Every single paper that gets funded doing health research is going to refer back to this. And, then it becomes a matter, are people actually being held to the standard that they're saying that they're holding up? In place of a lot of research, empirical research to kind of demonstrate the importance and the existence of research waste, I often share these two quotes. They're quite dated now in some ways, but they're every bit as relevant today as they were when they were said. These are both, this is Marcia Angel, who is the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, expressing a lot of doubts about the quality of medical research. Richard Horton, still somehow the editor of The Lancet, sharing similar doubts more recently in 2015. And I find these statements to be particularly compelling, not just because of the kind of the authority and the experience of the people who are sharing these thoughts. But there is a certain degree of complicity that when you're in this type of a role, you're leading the New England Journal of Medicine, you're leading the Lancet, and you're saying that, even in the journals that you're kind of at the top of have these problems. I think we should be taking that very, very, very seriously. And to some degrees, we're starting to, for I think, for both better and for worse. Again, this usually when I give this talk, I'd have a lot more here, but I'll just point to the UK has talked about a meta science unit. In other words, having something that is, centrally or government funded, an organization that looks at the science itself, so meta science being the science of science, and with a lot of focus on some of these issues around quality and reproducibility. In the States, unfortunately, we're seeing, in my opinion, a weaponization of these, what are normally good ideas. But this language around poor research quality and poor reproducibility, in my opinion, again, is being weaponized by the current administration to selectively punish the types of research it doesn't like, and then ignoring that for the research it does. So we are seeing a widespread acknowledgement of research waste that just didn't exist even 10 years ago. And to me, that's a really important thing that I'm trying to get across to investigators and anybody else, to understand that I think the ground is changing beneath our feet in this particular way. Coming back to these ideas of research waste, this is how I kind of view it from my role as a statistician and someone who leads a data management team. We have the question, the design, and an analysis plan. And then we move into things like data capture and actually executing the analysis. And I've kind of colored those differently just to reflect, really, these are more technical jobs or technical roles rather than purely scientific, but they're every bit as important to this overall process, right? So then we get to interpretation, reporting, and ongoing data stewardship. And again, the perspective here is that if at any point along this chain we get things wrong, then there's no point in doing the research from the first place, right? If we and not only could this be wasteful research, there are things that can happen where the research that we produce, we don't know that it's wrong and actually can lead to harms. And again, I would normally have lots of examples, but I'm going to focus on just this one. So this was an analysis that was done and published in JAMA. And importantly, on the left side was the main result from the paper as it was originally being prepared to be published. And essentially what you saw is a comparison of an intervention versus usual care, as we would often do in clinical trials. And the result very clearly demonstrated, due to the clear separation of these two lines, and our very happy p less than 0.05. So the investigators were surely doing backflips there, and JAMA was surely happy to publish it. But this result says that the intervention is beneficial. The reality is that during the process of analyzing these data, the genuinely expert team at Johns Hopkins, obviously a very highly respected place, they flipped the labels on the treatment arms. And so the truth of this story was that usual care was actually better. The intervention was indeed harmful. And, they were able to catch this because Hopkins knows what they're doing and had processes in place to check things. They caught it kind of late in the process, to be sure. And I think that there's a few things here that stand out for me. It's a really clear-cut example of how, if we don't catch these errors, we might create patient harms, but also that, anybody can make these kinds of mistakes. Again, if you're talking about kind of the Johns Hopkins Biostatistics Center, you'd find few places in the world that probably have, as rigorous of procedures and the rest of it, but they still were able to make this mistake. They were still able to update their procedures to prevent it from happening in the future. So this is just really stands out to me. And this has nothing to do with being a statistician. This is just, this is attention to detail and process is where these kind of errors can happen. Coming back briefly to Helsinki, again, they've added some stuff around duty to make available research objects data and the rest of it. But at the end, they've also had this part here about, conducted by individuals with appropriate education, training, and qualifications. And really, this mirrors what's been in ICH GCP for quite some time. But ICH GCP goes quite a bit further to say there are aspects of medical studies, clinical trials. Here, obviously, this applies to clinical trials of medicines, where they explicitly explain that you require a qualified statistician. So any regulated study is going to have to show the regulator that there was, an actual statistical expert. Now, in Ireland, we don't have many of those kind of roles like the ones that I have. If we look over to the UK, we can look at the CTU network. Obviously, it's a much bigger country population-wise, but if we were just to focus in on Aberdeen, Aberdeen at the clinical trial unit there has 8 FTE statisticians working across various studies. Right, and for me in Cork, Aberdeen, it's not just the director there is a friend of mine, but also it's on the edge of Europe. It's a kind of similarly sized study, similarly sized city, about 300,000 people, and they alone have 8 FTE statisticians. Several years ago, the HRB put out this kind of description of the infrastructure they were funding. It wasn't entirely right in the details then, and it's changed a bit since then. But generally speaking, it highlights about 6-7 statisticians and a handful of data managers spread across various sites. And again, this has changed a fair amount, but it's not a difference in kind, or this is about what we have now. If I look at my colleagues in terms of RCSI, Galway, Limerick, ourselves in Cork, TCD, UCD, most have a small handful of statisticians at best that are doing the kind of work that I do within the CRF, which again is not an academic statistician getting research money to do my own research, but rather supporting patient-focused studies in the areas of statistics, data management, and the rest of it. And so unfortunately, what that means is a great deal of funded health research in Ireland follows this kind of model for how it manages data and does statistics and the rest of it, which is a lot of use of Excel, usually without any kind of built-in guardrails to prevent data errors. It's a lot of kind of, unfortunately, people guessing and choosing how they should best analyze those data, usually using software that they learned about when they were undergraduates, and it doesn't support very good reproducibility, like something like SPSS. And probably most importantly, a lot of this research is being conducted by people who don't have the appropriate time in their schedules to be doing the research, and particularly for my clinically qualified colleagues who are, as far as I can tell, trying to do everything all at once, all the time, including leading research. So this is not a particularly good recipe for preventing research waste. All right, so we'll come into coming around the bend here. This was an article that got put into the New York Times. This was kind of mid-COVID, and what we were understanding, the research world, the gears started turning, the funding started flowing, and the world turned itself to COVID research. And we quickly learned is that we were completely flooded with low quality, low actionability studies. Everybody wanted to help, everybody wanted to do the right thing, but like a lot of other things, we've managed to turn an important problem more into an opportunity to advance careers and publication records, and to actually answer questions that needed to be answered. And that's increasing now with the advent of generative AI and the large language models, which are facilitating almost amplifying this to the nth degree now. The ease to produce things that look authoritative, that look well done, is a whole other tool. And so this important question of how do we identify flawed research? So yes, back to the important part. So I do like to throw out a thought every once in a while before I share it with actual sensible people, so I can sense check myself. I've added a few things here. So yeah, so who can stop unsound research? And just to quickly kind of think about this, I'm thinking about this in terms of, one, where the incentives lie and who has the expertise to do it. And generally the incentives would just sit with publication pressure, and increasingly how that's reflected through university rankings, and which is a whole other thing I could grumble about. So we have the incentive issue. And then the other root, I think, issue we have is that, frankly, many and most scientists, but certainly not all, are not well trained in statistical thinking, which is really more about uncertainty than anything else. And they're not well trained in data skills, so actual application of statistical models, data management, and the rest of it. And so when we use other researchers as essentially gatekeepers for what is quality, I think we run into a lot of trouble there. So do I think researchers in universities, I mean, theoretically, all of these stops are places that could stop unsound research. I'm of the opinion that researchers in universities are not well incentivized to do that themselves. I mean, many are. Again, I'm generalizing some here, obviously. Research ethics committees, again, our animal ethics committee would have a formal requirement for a statistician, our National Research Ethics Committee for clinical trials, and most research ethics committee don't. And I get brought into questions every so often, from CREC and Cork and others, to comment on a method. But generally speaking, I think research ethics committees don't have the methodological expertise to catch things that should be catchable. I'll skip funders since you're all here. Journals before it's published, again, reviewers are just other scientists. Some of them know what they're talking about. Many of them don't when it comes to methods. And sometimes even worse, you'll find a lot of performative reviewing. So reviewers will say things very confidently about statistics that are very, very wrong. And I experience this frequently. Probably one of the bigger frustrations, to try to respond to a very senior academic who's been very successful with their career and explaining why the thing they're talking about is just outright incorrect. I mean, journals after it's published, forget it. We have all the experience in the world to show that retraction is very, very difficult. There's a legal liability there for publishers. They're very slow to respond, even to the most outrageous fraud. And that's not what we're talking about. What we're generally talking about is kind of clumsy research. Press offices and journalists, university press offices, are completely incentivized to amazingly hype everything that we produce. Everything we produce in Cork is world class, and it's exactly the same for Trinity and UCD and all the rest of them. We don't ever produce average research. We only do very excellent things. And certainly policymakers, when it gets to them, they're completely, and this is no fault of their own, they're generally completely helpless. They have to rely on us, so to speak, to make sure that the research getting to them. So one of the things that, and this is kind of the last point here, funders before it's funded and funders after it's funded. I think that it's really a unique opportunity for funders before it's funded. And because once it's funded, then you as funders, you join the incentive to make sure that whatever comes out of that research that you've already paid for is perceived as being fantastic, right? Because you also have people to report to, I presume. Now, I am not a mind reader. And so please, 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 if I've got the wrong end of the stick, I'd really like to hear about it. I'd really like to hear about what your opinions are on this. But that's how I see it. So I see that funders before it's funded, among all these places where we should be picking up on kind of clumsy or unsound research from a methodological perspective, this to me is the most unique and most kind of opportunistic way to do that, in my opinion. And then just to wrap up, just a couple of things to throw out for discussion. I do a lot of talks, with my peers and other researchers. Recently gave some talks on ICAT, the Irish Clinical Academic Training Scheme. Some of our very brightest earlier career clinician investigators. I'm always the first person to explain to them that research waste is a thing and what we might do about it. This is not something that sits in our kind of usual research training curricula. I worry about the lack of statisticians defined broadly. I'm an epidemiologist by training. You don't have to have a PhD in statistics to do what I do. But I am worried about further de-skilling. We just don't have that many people, and especially now as we've shifted a lot of our training to kind of more industry-focused programs in data science and AI, it's very hard to find, high level quantitative skilled people to work in academia, because they can go do financial maths, they can work for gambling companies, they can work for pharma, they can work for AI startups and all the rest of that. One thing that stands out to me, I support a lot of grant applications, and because that's before the funding exists, there's a lot of design work that goes into that. And that design work is not explicitly funded, and it's at the root of what goes into the applications. Now, I think it's totally reasonable that that's the universities pay us, and that's where that time should go, and we do our best. But at the end of the day, I think all of you would be very aware at often how rushed a lot of applications are. And so at a time where we should be moving the slowest in some respects, I often find that's when my colleagues are having to move the fastest. I think that, and again, I'm very happy to be challenged. Again, I'm not a mind reader, but this is something I think funders think universities provide the necessary research infrastructure. And I think universities think that funders will pay for the infrastructure if they really want it. And so I think that there's sometimes a mismatch there between what's actually available to support research and what the expectations are. And then finally, the thing I think that stands out, kind of bigger picture, is I don't think there's enough appreciation for how precarity can lead to research waste and challenge research integrity. When we're always trying to, find the next group of research assistants and research support officers, and these are all very precarious jobs. People move on quickly. They have to be replaced within a study being run. And so I think that is this thing that gets often overlooked. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I will shut up and happily take questions or discussion or whatever. And thank you.